Welcome to Australia, the lucky country, and in this video we're going to be looking at 9 main democracies that protect their freedom of speech in their constitution and ask the question, why doesn't the Australian constitution protect our freedom of speech? Why can't our freedom of speech be enshrined in this constitution like all other democracies? Why hasn't Labor and Liberal parties sought to protect our freedom of speech by enshrining it in the Constitution when they've had decades to do so? Why is there only one political party that wants to hold a referendum to protect your human rights, freedom of speech for every subsequent generation? Should we be discussing this? Anyway, let's have a look at 9 democracies that protect their citizens' freedom of speech. So first and foremost, everyone knows America has the First Amendment, so let's have a quick look at the Constitution of the United States and their First Amendment. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, being protesting, etc. But nothing shall impede the freedom of speech. That is a basic human fundamental right that people are able to have their freedom of conscience, internally thinking, and then externalize their speech. Why should that be limited? Why in Australia, as of January 2026, our political parties want to imprison people for exercising their freedom of speech, which we simply don't have? That's very akin to a communist country. If you speak about certain topics, we imprison you. That's a communist country. That's not a democracy. And we should be taking strides to protect our freedom of speech, seeing it has been impacted, these hate speech laws being produced to all of Australia. Let's look at the Government of Canada and the Constitution. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We should be putting something similar to this into our Australian Constitution. Whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognise the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Guarantee of rights and freedoms. These are basic human rights, by the way. Rights and freedoms in Canada. Number 1. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it's subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Fundamental freedoms. Fundamental freedoms. Everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. Freedom of conscience and religion. Why not? Freedom of thought, belief, and opinion and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Freedom of thought. Conscience, freedom of belief. Why can't everyone believe whatever they want to believe? Everyone has been exposed to different amounts of information, and everyone should be able to draw their own conclusions about what they want to believe, not have beliefs forced upon them. The right to opinion and the right to that expression. Why shouldn't we have this stuff in the Australian Constitution that protects Australian values and your ability to speak without being imprisoned? Now, that doesn't give way to defamation, because defamation even applies to American law. You can't slander individuals or harass them or threaten to execute them and that sort of stuff. But the fundamental basic rights of freedom of speech and people to engage in debate about any given topic on the face of the earth is now restricted in Australia. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. So that is the Constitution of Canada. So this one is basically the German constitution, and this is the basic law for the Federal Republic of Germany. So if we go down to Article 5, every person shall have the right freely to express and disseminate his opinions in speech, writing, and pictures, and to inform himself without hindrance from generally accessible sources. Freedom of the press and freedom of reporting means of broadcasts and films shall be guaranteed. There shall be no censorship. There shall be no censorship. Now, why can't we have this stuff in the Australian Constitution that guarantees that Our political parties cannot pick and choose what information they want you to be exposed to, so you can make up your own mind. Now, if people have got opinions that people may not like, at least you know the people that are coming up with those opinions. You want to know the many different types of people in societies, which people hold the opinions that aren't true to your values. Then you can stay away from them. But to silence everyone and make everyone sound like everyone lives in peace is basically to censor all of the so-called evil people or the people with bad intentions to go underground. They're still going to act in the same way. It's just you're not going to have any precursor warnings to what they're thinking. You want people to think and you want people to express their thoughts. Why? Because then you know what they're thinking about. It's a fairly fundamental, basic human right. So why can't we have there shall be no censorship? I do freestyle these videos, so bear with me. Why should we not have no censorship in Australia? Why can't we know what other people are thinking about topics that affect our everyday lives? Let me know in the comments if you agree or not. So that is the German Constitution, Article 5. Have a look if you want to read it yourself. So this one is can you see it? Yep, just having a look at the screen whether or not you can read it. The Constitution of Japan. Now, if anyone knows any basic history, during World War II, Japan was invading everywhere. Everyone knows that the Crusade in the Pacific during 1942s, everyone knows how it was affecting Australia. Everyone knows how it affected much of the world and how that ended. But now they're some of our best allies. Japanese people, absolutely fantastic. I've personally traveled across America and many other third world countries, and I absolutely love Japanese people. Absolutely brilliant. At today's standards, they are awesome. They're part of our allies. They're part of our friendship groups. Bring them in, absolutely. But they have a constitution that protects their freedoms. Why can't we have that in Australia? Let's have a look. So if you're wondering whereabouts you can find it in the Japanese constitution, well, let's have a look at Article 21. Freedom of assembly and association, as well as speech, press, and all other forms of expression are guaranteed. We have guaranteed freedom of speech in our Australian constitution, as well as no censorship. So we can understand people's free speech. We can understand what they think. As you can see, one of our closest allies, the Japanese people, have guaranteed freedom of free speech. Now let's do that. This is another democratic country. No censorship shall be maintained, nor shall the secrecy of any means of communication be violated. We're not saying that people in the government are going to be able to reveal secrets and all that sort of stuff. We're just saying that the general people, the 28 million people of the Australian population, should be able to have free speech on any given topic and not end up in prison. Like, that's not a democracy. That's borderline coming communism. Do we want to live in a communist country? Like, let us know in the comments what you think. Should we be voting in, as our democratic right, other political parties that do want to hold a referendum, that do value your freedom of speech? It is a shame that there's only one or two other political parties that actually want to protect your speech. Let us know in the comments whether or not we should have free speech. Now let's turn to the Constitution of India. It's my understanding that India may have freedom of speech in their constitution, but it may not be practiced. This is only my own political opinion about why that may be, is because when political parties start mild censorship and the people don't push back against their human rights being violated, that incremental step from stealing your freedom gets worse and worse generation by generation. Here in Australia, we are a little bit different. We're a lot younger country that is formed in the Federal Constitution of 1901. But should we be saying, letting our freedoms be trodden all over and be removed and not speak up? Like, is that the future we really want? Or do we take this opportunity to say, no, you've just limited our free speech, and maybe we want to vote in other political parties that do have our Australian values and that do have our interests at heart? Because in my political opinion, while I'm still allowed to have it, I don't believe the Labor and Liberal parties actually have our interests at heart. Yes, we all know they line their pockets with money, but when it comes to actually imprisoning citizens just for wanting to speak about topics, it's gone too far. That's communism. I'm not talking about inciting violence. I'm not talking about, threatening people's lives and whatnot. I'm just talking about having basic communications. Why is that being held against us as Australian citizens? I just think these two political parties, I have voted for them in the past. I probably won't in the next election just because they haven't demonstrated the types of people that are in these political parties, that they have the Australian values at heart. I think they're causing more damage than good now. But nonetheless, let's have a look at the Indian Constitution, and we are going to be going to Article 19. So, right to freedom. Article 19, protection of certain rights regarding freedom of speech, etc. So let's have a quick look. And here is the right to freedom, Article 19, protection of certain rights regarding freedom of speech, etc. All citizens shall have the right to freedom of speech and expression. It's the number one line, the very first part of the Indian Constitution in section Article 19, 1A. The basic human right to freedom of speech and expression. Why can't we have this in the Australian Constitution when all of our democratic allies, our democratic friends that we do trade with, they all protect their citizens' speech? Whether or not that plays out in real world scenarios because of the incremental erosion of people's freedoms over time. But here in Australia, like I said, we're a young country, 120 odd years old since the Federation. So why should we, at such an early point, be giving up our freedom of speech, which I believe in my implied freedom of political communication under sections 7 and 24 of the Australian Constitution, which we'll get to later? Why should we give away our freedom of speech? Why should we be threatened with imprisonment just because we want to talk about different topics? It doesn't mean we're hateful. It doesn't mean that we want to threaten people. We just enjoy having conversations about different aspects of life. And why should we be facing imprisonment just for doing that? I don't agree with it. Let me know in the comments if you agree with it. I think as Australian citizens and Australian values, we should be doing better than this. So let's turn now to the South African government and their Constitution of the Republic of South Africa and have a look at their Bill of Rights. Now, I haven't been to South Africa. I'm not saying that everywhere is perfect, but I'm just saying at some point in time, people that make up political parties that want the interests of their peoples at heart, they have included these basic human rights into their constitution. Now, we can't help that toxic people get into political parties and look to imprison people and look to exploit people's human nature. We can't help that. But what we can help is electing political parties that do want to hold a referendum, that do want to put your human rights into the Australian Constitution. So when we do have decent people in our political parties, they can actually uphold your freedom of speech, your freedom to talk without the fear of imprisonment. So without further ado, let's have a look at the South African Bill of Rights, which Australia should have soon, hopefully. Let us know in the comments. And we're just going to go down here to Article 16, if you want to download and have a look later on. Freedom of expression. Freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, which includes freedom of the press and other media. And this is the one that I like. Freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, which is freedom of speech. It comes back to a true democracy is basically freedom of conscience, freedom to be able to speak those thoughts. And they're very well protected in the South African Constitution. Freedom to receive or impart information or ideas. So people are able to communicate about anything they like. That doesn't mean threats of war. That doesn't mean intimidation. But that just means that you don't need to agree with people and you don't have to avoid certain topics, which is just, it's very toxic. So let's keep going. Freedom of artistic creativity and academic freedom and freedom of scientific research. Academic freedom. When you suppress academic freedom, you take away any objective nature. You basically give whoever is in academia the authority to dictate what you're allowed to be taught, to dictate what you must believe. That's not education. That, unfortunately, should be excluded pretty much from every academia in the world. We should be practicing academic freedom at all, and including every perspective that people may have. But it does not extend to, and this is what we should be putting, something along the lines of this into the Australian Constitution. The right in subsection 1, which is your freedom to speak, does not extend to propaganda of war. Absolutely. Incitement or imminent violence. Absolutely. Completely agree. Advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, or this. Absolutely. But if this is in our Constitution, hatred, incitement. So the problem with the hate speech bill is their very loose terminology about what is psychological harm, and the use of the words, if it makes people feel intimidated. The Constitution, it should be very clear. If people are I'm effing going to ill you, that's fairly obvious. If people are propagating to intimidate and harass in large numbers against individuals, that's a fairly intuitive and obvious reason that people are being harassed, or that people are being incited of hatred towards them. But we shouldn't be giving up our freedom of speech to talk about the plethora of topics that have been restricted in the hate speech laws. I think there's about 9 or 10 protected areas now that you're not allowed to speak about. I do cover that in another video, so have a look at that. So let's have a look now at the Danish Constitution and see what they have to say about freedom of speech. So what does the Constitution, the Constitutional Act of Denmark, the Danish Constitution say in section 77? Any person shall be at liberty to publish his ideas in print, in writing, and in speech, subject to his being held responsible in a court of law. Censorship and other preventive measures shall never again be introduced. I'll repeat that. Like many other democratic countries, censorship and other preventive measures shall never again be introduced, because they know firsthand the consequences that happened in many European wars. So why is our Australian political parties continually introducing censorship laws to control what you are allowed to see? And it's not for the interests of the Australian people, it's to control what your narrative is. When you can control what information people see, then you can control how they think and how they perceive political parties. And that is not a free and open democracy. We should be putting free speech in our Constitution, and we should be, exactly like the wording here in our fellow democratic countries, censorship and other preventive measures shall never again be introduced. That is exactly what we should be having in Australia, is a censorship-free and open democracy that we should be having right now. We can't help the type of toxic people that get into political parties that form these toxic communist policies and dictatorship legislation. But what we can do, and is our legal right, with the implied freedom of political communication, is to elect parties in place that do have our interests at heart, that do want to hold a referendum for the people and physically ask each individual, do you think free speech should be in your Constitution? Do you think that censorship, prevention of censorship, should be in the Constitution to protect your rights to information? I absolutely think it should be. I think it's an absolute appalling situation that our political parties, Labor and Liberal, for decades have not bothered to do this. I think their time is expiring as political parties, because political parties always have a turnover of political members. And we don't have any control about which toxic people infect these political parties that make communist-style legislation and take away your freedoms as a society. Should we put up with that? I think we should use the power of the pen as our democratic right while we still have it, and elect political parties that do have your interests at heart. But let's have a look at the last one before we get to Australia. So let's turn now to the Federal Constitution of the Swiss Confederation, commonly known as the Swiss Constitution. And if we just scroll down to Article 16, freedom of expression and of information. Number one, freedom of expression and of information is guaranteed. Every person has the right freely to form, express, and impart their opinions. Every person has the right freely to receive information, to gather it from generally accessible sources, and to disseminate it. It's fairly intuitive that they have freedom of speech. So let's look at the freedom of the media. Freedom of the press, radio, television, and any other forms of dissemination of features and information by means of public communications is guaranteed. Number two, and this again, like the other democracies, censorship is prohibited. Why can't we have freedom of speech in our Australian Constitution, and why can't censorship be prohibited in Australia? Because that's pretty much what communist countries do. They'd like to censor information to control how you perceive political parties. That's not an open and free democracy when you literally encouraging censorship of your 28 million Australian citizens. Why can't we have censorship is prohibited in the Australian Constitution, as well as to protect our freedom of speech? These are fundamental basic human rights to access information as we deem fit and to be able to talk about our ideas rather than be threatened with imprisonment if people don't like us talking about certain topics. That's not a free and open democracy anymore. That's more of a communist approach to controlling citizens. That is something that does not stand well with our Australian values and is something that we should be choosing better political parties to look after our stewardship of the country. Why not? Let us know in the comments if you agree or disagree. So let's turn now to the Australian Constitution and have a look at how much protection or lack of protection we as Australian citizens actually have when it comes to freedom of speech, and why it's so important to protect it, definitely for future generations to come. Because if we allowed our basic human rights to be eroded, then what future do future generations actually have? Where they can't even speak, or they face threat of imprisonment, even if they just want to talk on various topics. So let us know in the comments. Subscribe if you get any value out of these. And let's have a look. So this document is the Australian Constitution with overview and notes by the Australian Government Solicitor. So this is produced, as you can see down here, by the Parliamentary Education Office and Australian Government Solicitor in Canberra. So these aren't my opinions. I'm just reading through some of these documents that are freely accessible on the internet, and it'd be great to get your ideas and thoughts about it. So let's scroll down to your rights, and let's have a very quick read. I'll just zoom in here, making sure you can still see it. So rights, the Constitution has no Bill of Rights. Like many of the other democratic countries do have Bill of Rights, not just America, such as that found in the United States Constitution, which prevents a legislator, which is like our political parties, from passing laws that infringe basic human rights. It recognizes right there that freedom of speech, such as freedom of speech, it recognizes that basic human rights is freedom of speech. It's actually written in our Constitution that we don't have freedom of speech protected, and it actually recognizes in its terminology passing laws that infringe basic human rights, for example, such as freedom of speech. So it already recognizes that freedom of speech is a basic human right. All I'm saying is that perhaps we should be voting for political parties that want to protect your human rights, that want to enshrine free speech into the Constitution like all of our other democratic partners. So let's keep reading. Some express protections, however, are given by the Constitution against legislative or executive action by the Commonwealth, but not by the states. Let's have a look further down here. And I'll just read you these two paragraphs because they're important with the next slide. The High Court, which is the Federal High Court, higher than Parliament, higher than the Prime Minister, the highest court in the land, has also recognised some implied restrictions on legislative power derived from the fundamental system of government established by this Constitution. For example, Because of the separation of powers affected by the Constitution, only a court may exercise its judicial power over the Commonwealth. Accordingly, a law of the Commonwealth Parliament cannot provide a criminal conviction by any body other than a court. The Federal High Court has made many, I've seen about 15 rulings on the implied freedom of communication on political matters, but that's not guaranteed because it's not an absolute. So let's read through one more paragraph. Another example of how implications from the terms or structure of the Constitution can restrict legislative power was provided in the 1992 when the High Court declared invalid a Commonwealth law which attempted to restrict the broadcasting of political advertising. The High Court decided that the restrictions imposed by that law were inconsistent with a necessary aspect of representative government entrenched by this Constitution, specifically the right to freedom of communication on political matters. So this new hate speech law, it's drawn a fine line between what is political matters able to be discussed and what is not political matters, and that's what you're going to be facing imprisonment with if they decide to weaponize that against you. So we are putting an enormous amount of trust in members of the public that you'll never meet, that pay their membership into political parties, that come up with ideas to maintain control and then take away your basic freedoms. So this is the very first step, that you still right now have freedom of communication on political matters, but under the new hate speech laws, everything that is not a political matter, that they've already put their protected groups in that hate speech law, then you can be facing up to 5 years imprisonment. That's not an open and free democracy. This is like impeding on our freedom of speech. And it's even recognized that freedom of speech is a basic human right. Why aren't we enshrining this in our Constitution? And I'll read you this one more just before. So if you want to amend the Constitution provides a mechanism by which it can be altered called a referendum. There is only one political party that I know of at the present moment, and hopefully all the political parties want to use the expression, fight for the Australian people's votes. And they all should want to hold a referendum. They should all want to protect our freedom of speech. It's extremely disappointing that there's only one political party in Australia that I know of at the moment that actually want to hold this referendum, that actually want to take all of our democracies around the world that all have their freedom of speech protected, and they want to put freedom of speech protections into the Constitution for every future generation. I don't see that as a negative. I find it very disappointing that there's only one political party actually willing to hold a referendum to protect your speech. And that's pathetic. The Labor and Liberal, they've had decades to do this. They've never bothered because they like to control what you're allowed to speak about. That's not an open and free democracy. That's a communist-style dictatorship. They're taking it too far as of January 2026. Now they're looking to imprison you if you talk about certain topics. Do you want to live in a democracy, or do you want to live in a communist country? Because that seems to be the direction that I seem to understand from, while I do have the implied freedom of political communication, that perhaps that's the direction of Australia. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you want freedom of speech? Let us know in the comments. So I'll just read you a very quick section of this, and then we'll get on to something more exciting. So the implied guarantee of free political communication. So on the 30th of September 1992, the Federal High Court published its reasons for decisions in 2 cases, which may well mark an important change of direction in constitutional law in this country, being Australia. In these decisions, the court recognised that the legislative powers of the Commonwealth are subject to an implied prohibition that the laws of the Commonwealth may not unduly restrict freedom of communication on political matters. That's all that, if you feel like reading it in your own time. So what does that mean? It interprets that, in my opinion, it interprets that the Constitution does protect the implied freedom of political communication on public matters that we can freely talk about. And it seems like these hate speech laws, like I said before, have drawn a fine line between what is political communication and what is not. And that's what's, from my opinion, that's been legislated. That's a major impact on freedom of speech. That's why we need to hold a referendum, as per some of these political parties, enshrined in our constitution so everyone has those same equal human rights for every generation to come. But let's just go to the next page and have a look. So in this Western Australia law review of the Constitution, the source and extent of this guarantee that we call implied freedom of political communication. In the course of the decisions, 6 of the judges, which was from the Federal High Court, accept that the Constitution guarantees a right to speak freely on political matters. Freedom to communicate about political matters was upheld to be an essential feature of representative government, which is the system ordained by the Constitution as evidenced particularly by sections 7 and 24. They also accepted that the right is not absolute. So your implied freedom of communication on political matters is not absolute, but our current point in time, it's implied, so we have access to it. All I'm saying is that while we are having our freedoms taken from us, while we do have a voice to speak up about freedom issues and what are human rights, before our Australian values and human rights are entirely taken away from us, because it is not the right to, is not absolute, and maybe we should have it enshrined in our Constitution so it does protect your freedom of speech, and it does, and we should have a prohibition on censorship so we are a true, open and free democracy for many generations to come. The alternative is that we don't vote in these political parties that have our interests at heart, and we end up being silenced and we slowly go towards a communist country. Is that what the Australian people want? I don't think it is. We've always had freedom of speech, but you've always been responsible for your actions. If you go into someone's house with a shotgun and going to rob them, you end up in prison. And I don't think anyone feels sorry for you because you're responsible for those actions. Freedom of speech, we should be able to debate any ideas about any topic. And just because people may be offended that you're discussing an alternative perspective doesn't mean you should be locked in prison. That's more communist than democracy. And democracy's been around for thousands of years. Is it worth protecting? Absolutely. Look at the atrocities of World War I and World War II. You want to fight against dictatorship. We don't want Australian dictatorship. We don't want Australian communism. We want the Australian democracy, freedom of speech, prohibition on censorship, enshrined in our Constitution. Let us know in the comments if you agree. Let's get this going and let's vote in some people that actually have our Australian values and interests at heart. But let's look at sections 7 and 24 and why we have implied freedom of communication. So apparently, in my opinion, as we've been reading, the only reason you have the implied freedom of political communication is because of this particular section, number 7, part 2, the Senate, number 7. The Senate shall be composed of senators for each state directly chosen by the people of the state, voting until the Parliament otherwise provides as one electorate. You can read yourself the rest of section 7, the Senate, but essentially it's not possible to be elected by the people unless we have implied freedom of political communication to make our decisions. Can that be reinterpreted in the future? Absolutely, because it's just a perception that we have this freedom. But if they take away this freedom of speech, then we have nothing. And that's when it is communist style, and that is when it is not a democracy anymore. And should we be allowing people to steal that from us, steal our basic human rights, that even the Australian Constitution, under that rights package that we looked at before, it even recognises freedom of speech as a human right, but it's just not protected in the Constitution. Should we change it? Absolutely. Let's have a look at section 24. And here we go, part 3. Excuse me. The House of Representatives. So, Section 24, the Constitution of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members directly chosen by the people. The only reason we have implied freedom of political communication is because it's physically impossible to elect people to the House of Representatives unless we're able to talk about political matters. That's why these new hate speech laws draw a fine line between not infringing on this implied freedom of communication in the Constitution, but everything else are now protected groups. And understanding the difference between that is going to be a learning curve for all of us, because how do you use the wrong verb, you go to prison. You accidentally say something as a sarcastic, rhetorical, sarcastic humor that some people may take offense to, and you end up in prison. Like, that's not really an Australian democracy, is it? So we really should learn to be tolerant of other people's opinions, but we should be responsible for our actions, because that's essentially what's causing the damage. But we can get around that with the wording like the other constitutions about you can't incite violence, you can't incite threats, etc. So let's turn now to a political party. I'm not associated with them. I don't have a membership with them. I've never really cared for politics until our freedom of speech is taken away from us. And they've done a good job of doing that. So if you know of any other political parties that actually want to protect your freedom of speech, then let us know in the comments which ones they are. And let's have a read through their policies so we can actually enshrine some of this stuff in our constitution, like all the other democracies that we've gone through today. And let's protect our freedom of speech with no censorship. I don't see a downside of that, except for the toxic people in political parties that want to censor you. So like I said, I haven't met Pauline. I'm not associated with this, but let's have a look at her free speech policy. So free speech policy. Free speech is a fundamental right that must be protected in Australia. Our party believes it should be enshrined in the Constitution to safeguard open debate, free expression, and the rights of all Australians to speak their minds without fear. Now that sounds like pretty much every other democratic constitution that we've gone through today, but why don't we have these protections in our Australian constitution? Why aren't our values protected? Why isn't our human rights protected in the constitution? They're only implied and are not absolute. And it even states in the constitution that freedom of speech is a human right. That is not, and it's not protected. So why are not all the political parties going out of their way to put it in the Constitution? Why is this the only person who's actually wanting to do it? Like, that's extremely disappointing. But let's go on. One Nation is the only political party to have held a free speech conference this term and has led nationwide protests against government intrusion on this essential right. Senator Pauline Hanson has spearheaded efforts to enshrine free speech in the Constitution by moving to establish the framework for a referendum. Give the power back to the people, 28 million Australian citizens. You decide whether or not you want free speech. Why isn't every other political party doing this to protect this fundamental right? We will push for constitutional protection of free speech and work to repeal any laws or government bodies that restrict it. That's fantastic. Every political party should be doing that. This hate speech law must be repealed. To completely take away our freedom to discuss on many different topics in society is an intrusion on free speech and human rights abuse, in my humble opinion. If it's not human rights abuse, let me know in the comments why it's not. Anyway, censorship, speech regulations and bureaucratic overreach that silence Australians will be dismantled. Absolutely. Why aren't all the political parties doing this? Why don't the political parties want to know what the Australian people think? That to me is very communist style, but that's just my opinion. A free country depends on free speech. One Nation will always stand for your right to speak, debate and express your views. Why can't we do that? Why are we so restricted as a democratic Australian developed country that we don't have any protection over freedom of speech on certain areas? At the moment, we have implied freedom of political communication, but not free speech on all of the protected areas that have been introduced in January 2026 that we're all starting to learn what we are allowed to speak now, what we're not allowed to speak about. People are going to get that wrong by mistake. Do we really need to imprison people because they get a verb wrong here, or they don't know that they're insinuating different things? It's very communist style. It's almost like the thought police just entered the Australian communities. So let me know in the comments what you think. And do you want your free speech protected? Do you want to have a referendum that says, do you want to enshrine this in the Constitution for every generation and actually live in a true democracy like all the other democracies that have freedom of speech with no censorship? Let us know what you think. See you on the next video.